Going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down the road feeling bad. Going down the road feeling bad, and I ain't going to be treated this way.
If you're aware of Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, it's probably the result of a streamer or YouTuber playing through the game. That's not a bad thing. It's clearly one of the reasons the game has been as successful as it has, but it also gives the game something of a reputation of being a game designed for streaming online. Merging Goat Simulator-style absurdist humor with the sort of infuriating difficulty of something like a Mario Maker level or a Kaizo game, it would be easy to dismiss Getting Over It as a quirky game tailor-made to get attention by having YouTubers get angry and scream at a naked man in a pot for a few hours. But I think there's more going on here. The game makes it pretty clear it's something of a meditation on challenge, difficulty, failure, suffering, pain, and what they mean, so let's talk about failure.
If you're not ready for that, like if you've already had a bad day, then what you're about to go through might be too much. Feel free to go away and come back. I'll be here.
I've said before that win states and failure states contextualize play, and I still think that that's true. They, in conjunction with whatever metaphor wraps the mechanics, give meaning and direction to the otherwise abstract or arbitrary systems that drive our games. Win states tell players the system states that are desirable, and lose states tell players the states that are undesirable. But it's not a strict black-white, up-down, yin-yang thing. Despite simply describing opposite concepts, they actually accomplish very different goals. Win states tend to be more of a long-term or medium-term goal. They are the thing that you are aiming to achieve. You know, beat the level, win the game, that sort of thing. And once a victory is achieved, that particular challenge is then considered beaten. You have now achieved victory. We can move on. Failure states, on the other hand, present a more urgent threat. They tend to be the thing that prevents you from achieving the win state, or the complication that makes it more than a simple task. Consequently, where win states try to provide a sort of long-term context and promise of release, lost states afford an immediate tension. And for the record, lacking tension is fine. Sometimes you don't want ludic tension. Games like Tacoma, which can't be lost in the traditional sense, rely on narrative tension instead. You can still have engaging games without failure states or ludic tension, but by including the lost state, the fate of the game is now in question. Winning is no longer a certainty or a matter of simple effort. It's also probably important to point out for the sake of this piece that, like win states, lose states can be formal or informal, or explicit or implicit, whichever terminology you want to use. The point is that a lose state can be a formally recognized system state thing, like failing to keep a given virtue above the minimum 2 turns in a row in the Shrouded Isle, or an informal, implicit metaphor thing, like getting stung by bees in Animal Crossing. There's no real systemic recognition of the failure, but come on, you got stung by bees and you got a big welt, it sucks. Win and loss states are also potentially granular. Failing a jump is a loss of sorts and the end is nigh, but losing a life is a loss at a higher level of granularity, and losing all your lives is a higher level of failure still. So just because there aren't formal, permanent, high-level, game-over screen-style system lose states in Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, doesn't mean there aren't losses and failures to be experienced along the way. Just ask anyone who's played it.
Oof, sorry about that.
Getting Over It offers plenty of opportunities for losses at small, medium, and large scales of granularity, whether they're formally recognized or not. And they kind of are, given that the game automatically plays songs or sassy quotes when you lose significant progress.
I grow too old to dream.
Game academic Jesper Juhl has actually written what is, as far as I can find anyways, perhaps the only book dedicated to the nature of game failure. The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games. In it, he tackles failure from a number of perspectives, but early on inquires about what he calls the paradox of failure, which he phrases the following way. 1. We generally avoid failure. 2. We experience failure when playing games. 3. We seek out games, although we will likely experience something that we normally otherwise avoid. In other words, if games necessarily cause us an experience that upsets us, why do we play them? Yule frames this paradox as potentially a subset of the more generalized paradox of painful art, i.e. why do we read sad books or watch scary movies, and while he proposes a few solutions and attempts to reframe the paradox in different ways, the one that most interests me is the one based on work by Gregory Curry on the problem of painful art, and splits our desires between immediate emotional responses and long-term aesthetic demands. The example used by Curry, and by proxy Yule, is Desdemona from Othello, but this is a video game video on YouTube, so let's swap that out for Final Fantasy VII's Eris. The immediate desire when playing is that we don't want Eris to die because that's sad and we don't like being sad, but the long-term aesthetic desire is for Eris to die because it drives the conflict of the work and results in a more emotionally fulfilling experience that enriches the events and character interactions that follow. If Eris doesn't die, that meaning and aesthetic value are lost. It reframes the paradox not as contradictory behaviors, but conflicting desires. When Yule translates Curry's work to games, he frames it like this: the immediate short-term goal when playing games is to avoid failure, but the longer-term aesthetic goal is to play games that let us experience partial or temporary failure. There's something in experiencing a game that permits or at least opens the possibility to failure that we crave, even if we don't like it when we fail in the moment.
Can I see another's woe and not be in sorrow too? Can I see another's grief and not seek for kind relief? William Blake.
There are some other analyses on the paradox of failure in the book, and the whole thing is worth checking out, but the point is that we go into games expecting, at a minimum, the possibility of some pain and unpleasantness. Some part of us wants to be hurt. It is the territory that games are built on, victories to be savored and defeats that sting. But how did designers figure out that sting? Well, Yule also points to a distinction between failure and punishment. To quote Yule directly, to discuss whether a game is easy or unfair, we should first distinguish between failure and punishment. When we say that games are becoming easier, it concerns not only our likelihood to fail at a given task, but also the punishment we receive upon failing. The frustration and pain we feel as we play games depends not just on how frequently we fail, but what the punishment is for failing. And it takes copious amounts of both for games to really elicit powerful pain. Yule cites Super Meat Boy as an example of a game that has regular failure, but very little in the way of punishment. Consequently, even though it is very difficult to make lots of progress in Super Meat Boy, it isn't seen as a particularly mean or painful game to play. Getting over it, however, not only involves regular failure and setbacks, but also punishment. Stern, uncaring, unyielding, massive amounts of punishment. Sometimes it's a reset of a few feet, maybe 45 seconds of work, maybe 10 minutes worth. Other times it's a cataclysmic failure, erasing the past hour or more of progress, sending you back to basically the start of the game with no recourse but to pick up your hammer and begin again as punishment for a single errant flick of the mouse, miscalculation of an angle, or misjudgment of force. It's not just hard to progress, but punishing for failure. And it's inevitable that you feel a little crushed every time it happens, even if you're expecting and accepting of it. And it's here where the anger and frustration at a game's eagerness to see you fail, and sadism in doling out penalties, meet with Yule's paradox of failure that Bennett Foddy has planted his flag with getting over it. The game makes no secret that it is very much interested in the idea of player suffering. The quotes and songs the game throw at you are all meditations on loss and endurance in the face of hardship.
When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new, wail my dear time's waste. William Shakespeare, Sonnet 30.
The monologue by Bennett Foddy himself that you hear as you progress through the game recognizes how cruel the tower he's built really is.
An orange is sweet juicy fruit locked inside a bitter peel. That's not how I feel about a challenge. I only want the bitterness. It's coffee, it's grapefruit, it's licorice.
He acknowledges that it takes a certain kind of player to progress, and in a sort of reverse beginner's guide, Foddy grows more intimate and believes that he, the designer, understands you more and more the further you get.
We have the same taste, you and I. It's not ambition, it's ambition's opposite. An obdurate mission to taste defeat.
Up to the point where he whispers his appreciation of your pain softly in your ear.
You've learned to hike. There's no way left to go but up, and in a moment I'll shut up. But let me say, I'm glad you came.
But more than anything, it's the design of the game that sells this idea of suffering. The challenges the game asks you to overcome are conquerable, but not even necessarily through direct skill. Fadi's previous efforts, like QWOP and GURP, are both difficult, failure-focused titles about indirectly controlling the movement of a character, but those games feel more like experiments in locomotion. QWOP highlights the difficulties in mapping individual human muscles to keyboard inputs, and GURP has players turning their fingers into pretzels to climb a mountain, reflecting the contortions of their avatar on screen. Getting Over It is, in this sense, similar. You don't control an avatar, but you control inputs that ask your avatar to do something. As Fadi himself points out,
Have you thought about who you are in this? Are you the man in the pot, Diogenes? Are you his hand? Are you the top of his hammer? I think not. Where your hand moves, the hammer may not follow, nor the man, nor the man's hand. In this you're his will, his intent, the embodied resolve in his uphill ascent.
Getting Over It intentionally removes you from direct control in order to make your movements less directly predictable, which leads to errant inputs, which leads to failure. And while both GURP and QWOP are very hard and involve a lot of hilarious failures, neither seems designed to punish players quite like Getting Over It. Part of that is the scoring system. QWOP and GURP both feel like the goal is to see how far you can get. Getting Over It, however, offers only the singular challenge: climb the mountain and beat the game, or don't. That seems like a minor design change, but it totally recontextualizes failure. If I get further than I've ever gotten in QWOP, but then I trip, I still feel like that loss is kind of a victory. I have now moved further than I've ever come before, and the game recognizes it. If I get further than I've ever gotten in Getting Over It, and then plummet to the beginning, that is just that much more progress lost. It is a game designed to elicit specific feelings of frustration, aggravation, and loss from players, in part by removing direct control of your avatar, and in part by designing a map and progression system where various levels of failure are likely but go unremarked upon. I'm not certain how long Getting Over It was actually in production, but frustration seems to have been on Fadi's mind for a while. In January of 2017, Fadi published a list of different types of game frustration in his blog. It's an amusing article, and my favorite part is that in typical blog fashion, the headline was "A list of some of my favorite flavors of frustration in games. Number 7 will shock you," and then the list intentionally skips the number 7 in an attempt to make the list itself frustrating. Regardless, in it, Fadi states, quote, "Game designers take it as axiomatic that if players feel frustrated, something has gone wrong with the design. Yet frustration is an essential ingredient in many, all, of the most famous and influential designs. What would Space Invaders be if you never had to start again? What would Myst be like if you were never stumped? A game that is completely devoid of frustration is likely to be a game without friction, without disobedience. Games that are perfectly obedient are mere software." And I love how this encapsulates a lot of Fadi's design methodology, that the player should never be fully in control of the experience, whether that means the physical bodies or the systems at large. That systems shouldn't be pliable and wait for the player to come through and win, but push back against player intent to some degree. It also hints at a frustration with modern mainstream game design, which is a target of Getting Over It in one way or another. It's no secret that through the 2000s and into the 2010s, traditional single-player games have grown increasingly forgiving. As budgets have blown out of control and as content has gotten more expensive, ensuring that every dollar spent on beautifully rendered levels and characters is actually used and seen by players has become a bigger and bigger priority. Additionally, a lot of these games have had an ever larger cinematic bent, with a focus on narrative and pacing. This meant that these sorts of games became less about a game's design and more about finding a simple core gameplay loop to keep your hands busy while you churn through canned scripted sequences designed to feel like they're systems driven. But at no point should the system actually try to stop you from making progress.
Get to the seawall! I'll meet you there! Well, don't breach that seawall!
But at a minimum, it means that these sorts of games can no longer be obstinate, unyielding, and uninviting. They can no longer be sour or difficult or mean-spirited. These games, by Fadi's definition anyways, are just software. Empty calorie saccharine treats that give you the dopamine release of victory reliably and cheaply and at no cost or sacrifice. Getting Over It seems like a response to that school of thought. Obviously, its design breaks with tradition. It embraces the pain of failure not just as a fact of life, but as something desirable, a bit of salt to make the sweet that much more delicious. But it carries this idea of inverting linear, content-driven games in the way it presents itself as well. Instead of expensive levels, delicately modeled 3D characters, and a storyline that carries itself with purpose and direction, the game is an absurdist dream that takes place on a mountain of trash, literally and figuratively. And that's Fadi's word, not mine.
For years now, people have been predicting that games would soon be made out of prefabricated objects, bought in a store and assembled into a world. And for the most part, that hasn't happened. Because the objects in the stores are trash. I don't mean they look bad or that they're badly made, although a lot of them are. I mean they're trash in the way that food becomes trash as soon as you put it in the sink. Things are made to be consumed and used in a certain context. And once the moment is gone, they transform into garbage. In the context of technology, those moments pass by in seconds.
The game's world is a pile of prefab elements, some original but some taken from asset stores and other places. The music is sampled from the public domain. In a Let's Play with Kotaku's Tim Rogers, Fadi even mentions that the player character is a stock Adobe Fuse model.
You rendered this guy yourself?
The guy?
Yeah.
No, he's a Adobe Fuse stock character number 1.
That's what I figured.
I see it. It's a game of disposable content, a game where the content itself doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the challenge, and the feelings it evokes mechanically, and that feeling more often than not is loss with moments of joy when getting to a new area, or even more rarely, reaching the summit. Still, I don't think it's a game that hates traditional game design thought. It doesn't loathe winning or even fetishize pain the way some Masocore platformers or Kaizu games do. But I think it does serve to pose the question of why we have moved away from punishments and disappointments and the more aggravating aspects of games, especially when they're so much a part of how we draw pleasure from them. Again, the paradox of failure suggests that while we don't like failure, we do find ourselves drawn to games that offer a real possibility of it. If Getting Over It does make a meaningful, lasting critique of games designed to be effortlessly consumed without pain, it's that, at least to Fadi, our failures make these challenges real.
Imaginary mountains build themselves from our efforts to climb them. And it's our repeated attempts to reach the summit that turns those mountains into something real.
If you can beat it effortlessly the first time out, is it really a challenge? If you were given an infinite number of chances to make this next little section perfectly right, is that really a challenge? Or is a challenge something that asks something of you and can take something in return? If the challenge of Getting Over It is more real than other games, it is because it is a singular challenge that many will not complete. It isn't designed to be completed, even if it technically can be. Like climbing Mount Everest or bowling a perfect game, it is a goal that is either met or not met. You can beat Half-Life on easy and you can win a hand of poker based on the luck of the draw, but there are no variables here. It exists on its own. It's not even about skill, per se, although you certainly get better as you play. More than anything, it's about perseverance, about having to put yourself through the ordeal and coming out the other side. And in that, there's an emotional realness that no number of scripted chase sequences or QuickTime event cutscenes can provide. Getting Over It also has something of a thematic B-side. The game's mountain of trash may well serve as a meaningful counterpoint to the very serious and highly advertised content in AAA games, but it also works as a critique of digital culture at large. The entirety of Getting Over It is, after all, based heavily on sexy hiking, a B-game made of various elements scraped together to form something new. Heck, that game's title sequence is basically a MIDI cover of the X-Files theme. Fadi has basically done an HD version of the same thing, collecting a pile of assets and not even attempting to give them cohesion, commenting on their nature as trash having been unmoored from any reasonable context.
Maybe this is what digital culture is. A monstrous mountain of trash, the ash heap of creativity's fountain. A landfill with everything we ever thought of in it. Grand, infinite, and unsorted.
But in that context, as digital trash, Fadi discovers a place for his harsh, acerbic mechanics.
Trash is disposable, but maybe it doesn't have to be approachable. What's the feeling like? Are you stressed? I guess you don't hate it if you got this far. Feeling frustrated? It's underrated.
Expensive digital games have to focus on accessibility, but cheaper games, B games, and indie experiments can afford to be rougher, harsher, and more indifferent. If there is a place for heartburn as gameplay, it exists here, among the trash. The game jam game made over a weekend, the rough-hewn work of an indie just starting out, the programmer art-filled games of a theorist that doesn't care about content but cares deeply about design and its implications. Maybe not everyone will get it, but given its budget and the scope of these games as digital trash, not everyone has to. If, as Fadi suggests, play has something akin to taste, there are flavors of it that can only be experienced by stepping outside of the safety of curated lists and 9 out of 10 reviews, and instead looking at asset flips and B games, and I think that's a lesson the YouTube audience desperately needs to hear more of. As you can tell from all the late game footage I've had to borrow from other corners of YouTube, I still haven't beaten it despite putting several hours into it. That tower of trash, that mountain of prefab assets is still there unconquered for me. And I've lost all my progress several times at this point. But each time getting back up becomes a little bit easier. And yeah, the gameplay does taste rough and bitter and uncaring, and I absolutely have to be in a certain mood to play it without just falling into frustrated despair. But maybe there's something to Foddy's idea that the game's unyielding nature makes it more real, because I don't feel bad that I haven't beaten the game. It doesn't really care that I have or haven't. It'll still be there, unchanged, waiting for me if I decide to try again. In the meantime, the progress I have made, and the progress I've lost, are all mine. And there's a sort of pride in knowing that even if I am to fall from great heights, as much as the landing might sting, I've done it before, and I can do it again. It may be a trash game contributing to trash culture, but that doesn't mean it's trash.
Going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down the road feeling